Winter is often portrayed as a season of warmth and togetherness. We think of the holidays, the sound of crackling fires, and the peaceful silence of a world blanketed in white. But there is a reason humans have feared the dark half of the year for millennia. When the sun disappears by 4 p.m. and the temperatures drop low enough to kill a man in minutes, the world shrinks. You are confined to your home, and the outdoors becomes a hostile, alien landscape. The snow doesn't just decorate the world. It muffles the sound of a window being pried open. It covers the tracks of someone who has been standing outside your bedroom for hours. And in the deep cold, the only thing more dangerous than the elements is the people who thrive in the isolation. I'm Mr. Horrorman, and tonight I'm bringing you 3 allegedly true accounts of winter nights that turned into living nightmares. These stories were submitted by listeners who are still looking over their shoulders today. Before we head out into the frost, do me a favor. If you enjoy long-form, realistic horror, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that this community wants more stories like these. And if you're new, hit subscribe and ring that bell. The winter is long, and you don't want to be left alone in the dark without a story to keep you company. Now, lock your doors, turn down the lights, and let's begin. Story 1. The Residents of the Crawlspace, a true winter nightmare. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in the deep winter. It's a heavy, suffocating quiet that happens when the snow is so thick it absorbs all sound. Most people find it peaceful. They sit by their heaters, drink their cocoa, and feel safe. But for Marcus, that silence was the start of a nightmare that would change his life forever. Marcus was a 24-year-old grad student when he took what he thought was the job of a lifetime. He was hired to be the winter caretaker for a massive estate on the shores of Lake Superior in northern Michigan. The owners were a wealthy couple who spent their winters in a high-rise in San Diego. They needed someone to stay in the house, keep the pipes from freezing, clear the snow from the roof, and, most importantly, ensure that no one broke in. The house was a sprawling, modern masterpiece of glass, cedar, and steel. It was beautiful, but it was lonely. The nearest neighbor was a 6-mile drive through winding, unlit forest roads. For a student who needed to study for his finals, it seemed perfect. He'd have total solitude, he'd have a paycheck, and he'd have the most beautiful view in the state. But Marcus didn't realize that when you are that isolated, you aren't just locking the world out, you're locking yourself in. And sometimes, you aren't as alone as you think. Marcus arrived at the estate in early January. The temperature was already hovering around 5 degrees, and a massive storm system was moving in from the lake. The house was even more impressive in person. It featured a crawlspace design, meaning the house didn't have a basement, but sat on a 3-foot concrete and wood foundation that allowed access to all the plumbing and electrical work. Inside, the house felt like a fortress. The center of the home was a grand living room with a 20-foot-high wall of glass that faced the lake. At night, that wall of glass became a black mirror. The first few days were uneventful. Marcus spent his time studying, drinking coffee, and doing light maintenance. But on the 4th night, the wind picked up. The lake-effect snow began to fall at a rate of 4 inches an hour. Visibility dropped to 0. Marcus sat in the living room, reading by the glow of the fireplace. Around 10 p.m., he heard a sound. It was a faint, rhythmic thump. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Thump. Pause. Thump. It was heavy. It didn't sound like a mouse or a squirrel. It sounded like something large was being dragged through the dirt in the crawlspace. Marcus stopped reading. He sat perfectly still, his heart racing. He told himself it was just the house settling. When the temperature drops that fast, the wood and metal of a house expand and contract, creating pops and groans. But this wasn't a pop. It was a deliberate movement. He walked over to the kitchen, where one of the main HVAC floor vents was located. He knelt down, pressing his ear to the metal grate. The air coming up was cold, and then he heard it, the sound of a long, slow breath. He jumped back, his skin crawling. He convinced himself it was just the wind whistling through the exterior crawlspace vents. He grabbed a heavy flashlight and went to the side of the house to check the hatch. The hatch was a small wooden door that led into the dark void beneath the house. It was secured with a simple latch. In the blinding snow, Marcus saw that the latch was closed. He sighed in relief. "Just the wind," he muttered. He went back inside, locked the front door, and went to sleep. He didn't know that the latch he had checked was just a decoy. The next morning, the power was out. The storm had knocked down a line somewhere in the forest. Marcus wasn't worried. He had a propane stove and plenty of wood. But as he walked into the kitchen to make breakfast, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. One of the floor vents in the hallway was crooked. The heavy metal grate had been unscrewed. The screws were sitting neatly in a row on the hardwood floor. Marcus stared at them. He knew for a fact they hadn't been like that when he went to bed. He knelt down and looked into the dark shaft of the vent. It was just a black hole. But as he reached out to put the grate back, he saw something caught on the edge of the ductwork. It was a small, white piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was a Polaroid, a photo shot with a flash in low light. The image showed a man sleeping. He was tucked under a blue comforter, his face turned to the wall. It was Marcus. The photo had been taken from the perspective of the vent in his bedroom. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Someone had been in the ductwork. Someone had been inches from his face while he was unconscious, taking a photo of him. If you're watching this right now and you have floor vents in your house, do me a favor. Look down at them. Are the screws still there? If you're feeling that cold knot of fear in your stomach, hit that like button. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you appreciate these deep dives into the dark side of humanity. Mr. Horrorman. Marcus didn't think. He grabbed his car keys and his coat. He needed to get out. He ran to the front door, but as he reached for the handle, he saw something through the sightlight window. His truck was sitting in the driveway, covered in 6 inches of fresh snow, but the tires were gone. All 4 tires had been removed. They weren't stolen. They were stacked neatly in a pile about 20 feet away from the truck, forming a bizarre rubber totem in the middle of the white wasteland. Whoever this was didn't want his truck. They wanted Marcus to stay. Marcus backed away from the door. He was trapped. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The roads were blocked by 4 feet of snow, and his only means of escape had been sabotaged. He grabbed a heavy kitchen knife and a fire poker. He decided he would lock himself in the upstairs master suite. But as he reached the bottom of the stairs, a voice echoed through the house. It was hollow, echoing through the ventilation system like a ghost. "Marcus, you shouldn't have looked in the hallway. I wasn't finished with the album." The voice didn't sound like a monster. It sounded like a normal man, calm, almost polite, and that made it 1,000 times worse. "Who are you?" Marcus screamed. "What do you want?" "I live here, Marcus," the voice whispered, seemingly coming from the floor beneath him. "I've lived here since October. The owners don't mind. They never even knew I was here. But you're loud. You walk too much. You move the furniture." Marcus realized with a jolt of terror that the man hadn't just broken in. He had been there the entire time. When the owners were home, when Marcus moved in, he had been a silent roommate, living in the dirt and the dark, watching the world through the metal grates. Suddenly, Marcus heard a loud clack in the living room. He ran to the doorway. The large, heavy vent cover for the main return air duct, a grate almost 2 feet wide, had been pushed up from below. A hand reached out of the darkness of the floor. It was a pale, filthy hand. The nails were long and jagged. Then a head emerged, a man with matted, greasy hair and eyes that were unnaturally bright. He was wearing an old, stained jumpsuit. He looked like he hadn't seen the sun in months. He didn't jump out and attack. He just sat there, half emerged from the floor, and smiled at Marcus. "I like the way you cook your bacon. The smell comes down into the pipes. It's very comforting." Marcus didn't wait to hear another word. He turned and bolted up the stairs. He slammed the master bedroom door and locked the deadbolt. He pushed a heavy dresser in front of the door. He sat on the bed, clutching the knife, his eyes fixed on the vent in the corner of the room. He waited. For 3 hours, he listened to the man walking through the house below. He heard the man opening the fridge, He heard the man sitting in the armchair in the living room, and then he heard the scratching. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was coming from the other side of the bedroom door. The man was using something metal to scratch at the wood. "Marcus, I'm bored. Let's look at the photos together." Mr. Horror Man. Marcus didn't know he couldn't stay in that room. Eventually, the man would find a way in, or the fire would go out and he would freeze. He looked at the window. It was a 20-foot drop to the ground, but below the window was a massive drift of snow that had piled up against the side of the house. He grabbed his phone, still no signal, and tucked it into his pocket. He wrapped a blanket around his arm, smashed the glass of the window, and climbed out onto the icy ledge. The wind hit him like a wall, nearly knocking him off. He didn't look back. He jumped. He hit the snowbank hard, the powder filling his lungs and mouth. He scrambled to his feet, his heart feeling like it was going to explode. He began to run. He didn't follow the road. He knew the man might be watching. He ran through the dense woods, the branches tearing at his face. He ran for nearly 2 miles until he reached the main highway. By some miracle, a county snowplow was passing by. The driver saw a man in a tattered coat, clutching a kitchen knife and covered in snow, waving his arms like a madman. The driver stopped. Marcus collapsed into the cab, sobbing. The police report. The Michigan State Police arrived at the estate 2 hours later. They expected to find a burglar. What they found was much more disturbing. They searched the crawlspace. They found a bedroom carved into the dirt beneath the living room. It was lined with stolen blankets and pillows. There were dozens of empty food cans, all neatly organized, and on the walls of the crawlspace, the wooden joists that held up the floorboards, there were hundreds of photos. They weren't just photos of Marcus. There were photos of the owners, photos of their guests, photos of the maid. Some of the photos dated back to 2 years prior. The man had been living in the house's lungs for over 24 months, undetected. They found the man hiding in the attic insulation. He didn't fight back. He just asked the officers if they could make Marcus come back because he wasn't finished with his winter project, Mr. Horror Man. Marcus never went back to the house. He didn't even go back for his clothes. He moved to a high-rise apartment in Chicago, a place with no crawl space, no attic, and no floor vents. But he told me that even now, years later, he can't sleep in total silence because every time the building settles or a pipe knocks or the wind whistles through a vent, he remembers that breath. He remembers the feeling of being watched from below. What would you do in that situation? Would you have stayed in the bedroom or would you have taken the leap into the dark? Let me know in the comments. And remember, when you're home alone this winter and you hear a sound coming from the floorboards, don't assume it's the house settling. It might just be your roommate waiting for you to fall asleep so he can take the next photo. I'm Mr. Horror Man. Stay warm, stay safe, and check your vents. I'll see you in the next nightmare. Story 2. The Woman in the Whiteout, a true suburban nightmare. We like to think of our neighborhoods as safe havens. We know the people 3 doors down. We know which cars belong in which driveways. But when a record-breaking blizzard hits, the familiar world disappears. The landmarks are buried, the streetlights flicker and die, and the neighbors retreat deep into their own homes. In that isolation, the suburbs become just as lonely and dangerous as the deepest woods. This story was sent to me by a woman named Chloe, and it serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes our empathy is the very thing a predator uses to destroy us. This happened in January 2019, during the infamous polar vortex that gripped the American Midwest. In Milwaukee, where Chloe lived, the temperatures had plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The city was a ghost town. No one was on the roads. No one was walking their dogs. The air was quite literally lethal. Chloe was a 29-year-old nurse. She was used to high-stress situations, but nothing in her medical training could have prepared her for what was about to knock on her door in the middle of the whiteout. Because the hospitals were understaffed and the roads were dangerous, Chloe had been working double shifts. She had finally made it home around 1 a.m., exhausted and freezing. She lived in a small 1950s-style bungalow, the kind of house that feels solid until the wind starts hitting 40 miles per hour. She was sitting in her kitchen trying to warm her hands on a mug of tea when she heard it. It wasn't a knock, it wasn't a bang. It was a rhythmic, wet slapping sound against the front door. Slap, slap, slap. Chloe froze. Her first thought was that a tree branch had snapped and was being blown against the siding, but the sound was too consistent. It was measured. She walked into the darkened living room. She didn't turn on the lights. Her nurse's intuition told her something was wrong. She pulled her phone out and checked her Nest camera app. Because of the blowing snow, the infrared night vision was struggling. The screen was a chaotic swirl of white flakes, but in the center of the frame, right on her porch, there was a dark, vertical mass. She approached the front door. The air coming through the seals was icy. She leaned forward and looked through the peephole. Her heart stopped. Standing on the porch, less than an inch from the wood, was a woman. She wasn't wearing a parka. She wasn't wearing boots. She was dressed in a thin, pale nightgown that was fluttering violently in the wind. Her skin wasn't just pale. It was a terrifying shade of blue-gray. Her hair was matted with actual icicles. She was shivering so violently that Chloe could hear her teeth clicking together through the heavy oak door. Now, ask yourself, if you saw a woman dying of hypothermia on your doorstep in minus 40-degree weather, what would you do? Your instinct would be to open that door. But as Chloe was about to learn, in the dark of winter, things are rarely what they seem. If you're enjoying this deep dive, make sure you hit that like button. It helps me keep these long-form stories coming. Now, let's head into the peaks. Chloe reached for the deadbolt. As a nurse, she knew this woman was in the final stages of hypothermia. If she didn't get her inside and into a warm bath immediately, she would be dead within minutes. But as her hand touched the cold metal of the lock, the woman on the porch did something strange. She didn't shout for help. She didn't beg to be let in. Instead, she leaned her forehead against the door and began to hum. It was a low, melodic sound that sat right underneath the roar of the wind. "Ma'am?" Chloe shouted through the door. "Ma'am, I'm calling 911. Just hold on. I'm going to get help." The woman stopped humming. She slowly raised her head and looked directly into the peephole. Her eyes were completely blown out. The pupils were massive, black voids. "He says it's your turn, Chloe," the woman whispered. Her voice was raspy like sandpaper on stone. "He says the house is warm. He says he wants to see the nurse." Chloe's hand flew back from the lock. A cold chill that had nothing to do with the Milwaukee winter raced down her spine. The woman knew her name. She knew her profession. Who told you that?" Chloe stammered. "Who were you with?" The woman didn't answer. She started slapping the door again. Slap, slap, slap. Chloe realized then what the sound was. The woman wasn't knocking. She was hitting the door with the back of her hands because her fingers were already frozen solid. They were as stiff as pieces of wood. Chloe backed away into the kitchen, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. While the phone was ringing, she looked out the small frosted window that faced her driveway. Through the swirling whiteout, she saw a white van idling at the curb. It had no lights on. It was just a ghost in the snow. And then she saw him. A man was standing at the edge of her property. He was dressed in high-end mountaineering gear, a heavy black parka, thick goggles, and a face mask. He looked like an astronaut on a frozen planet. In his hand, he was holding a long, thin pole with something attached to the end. He wasn't trying to help the woman. He was watching her. He was standing perfectly still, like a hunter watching a trap. The 911 dispatcher answered. Chloe frantically explains that there was a woman freezing on her porch and a man watching from the street. The dispatcher told her that due to the storm, the police were over 15 minutes away. "Tell them to hurry," Chloe whispered. I think he's hurting her." As she spoke, she saw the man in the parka raise a small device in his other hand. He pressed a button. On the porch, the blue-gray woman suddenly let out a strangled scream. Her body jerked violently, and she fell to her knees, clutching her neck. Chloe realized then, with a pure wave of horror, that the woman was wearing a collar, a heavy, industrial-looking device hidden under the collar of her nightgown. It was an electronic shock collar. The man wasn't just watching her, he was controlling her. He was using this dying woman as a biological key to get Chloe to open the door. He knew that a young woman, especially a nurse, wouldn't be able to resist helping someone in such obvious distress. He wanted the door open, he wanted access to the house, and he didn't care if the bait froze to death in the process. Chloe watched as the man in the parka began to walk towards the porch. He moved with a slow, predatory confidence. He knew the police wouldn't be there for a long time. He knew Chloe was alone. She ran into her bedroom and grabbed her husband's heavy baseball bat. She pushed her dresser in front of the bedroom door, then crawled under the bed, clutching her phone. She listened as the man stepped on the porch. She heard his heavy boots crunching the ice. She heard the woman on the porch whimpering, a sound like a wounded animal. And then she heard the front door handle jiggle. Rattle, rattle, rattle. The man wasn't even trying to be quiet anymore. He began to kick the door. Boom, boom, boom. The house shook with every strike. Chloe held her breath, tears streaming down her face, praying the deadbolt would hold. "Open up, Chloe," the man shouted. His voice was muffled by his mask, but the malice was unmistakable. "She's going to die out here. Is that what a nurse does? Do you just let them die?" The psychological warfare was almost more than she could bear. He was trying to guilt her into her own abduction. Suddenly, the kicking stopped. Chloe heard a vehicle door slide shut. She heard the sound of an engine revving. She looked at her Nest app one last time. The porch was empty. The blue-gray woman was gone. The man was gone. The white van sped away with its tires spinning in the deep snow before finding traction and vanishing into the whiteout. The police arrived 30 minutes later. They found the front door splintered but still standing. Chloe was still under the bed, refusing to come out until she heard the officers' voices and saw their badges through the window. When the detectives processed the scene, they found two things that changed the case from a suspicious person report to a federal investigation. First, they found a small black plastic casing in the snow on the porch. It was the housing for a high-voltage shock system, likely modified from a dog training collar. It had a small amount of blue-gray skin caught in clasp. Second, they found what the man had left at home. Before he got into the van, he had used a can of orange marking paint, the kind used by construction crews, to spray a message directly onto the snow in the middle of her driveway. In large, jagged letters, it read, "See you in the spring, nurse." The implications were devastating. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. The man had scouted her. He knew where she lived, he knew her name, and he knew her schedule. He had used the blizzard as a testing ground to see if he could lure her out. The police theory. The Milwaukee Police Department worked with the FBI to track down the white van. They discovered it was a stolen vehicle from 3 counties away. They believe the man was part of a highly organized trafficking ring that targeted medical professionals and social workers, people whose jobs made them prone to helping others. The woman in the nightgown? She was never found. The police believe she was another victim, likely kidnapped weeks earlier and broken through the use of the electronic collar. She was a disposable tool in the man's hunt for Chloe. Chloe didn't wait for the spring. She put her house on the market the very next day and moved to a gated community in another state. She still works as a nurse, but she told me that her heroic instinct is gone. Now, when she hears a knock at the door, she doesn't feel the need to help. She feels a paralyzing, icy fear. It's a sad reality of our world. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can be is a good person. Tonight, as you listen to the wind outside your own window, I want you to think about Chloe. I want you to think about the woman in the whiteout, and I want you to remember that your home is only a fortress as long as you keep the door locked. Which of tonight's stories was the most disturbing to you? Let me know in the comments below. And if you have a story of your own, send it to my email. You'll find it in the description. If you see someone in trouble tonight, call the police. But for God's sake, stay inside. I'm Mr. Horror Man. Stay warm, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Story 3. The Snow Angel Stalker, a true wilderness nightmare. There is a phenomenon in the high mountains known as the blue hour. It's that brief window of time after the sun is set, but before the world goes completely black. During this hour, the snow takes on a surreal, glowing hue, and the silence is so absolute, it feels like you've stepped off the face of the earth. For most people, that kind of isolation is terrifying, but for Kyle, it was his office. Kyle was a 32-year-old professional landscape photographer. His specialty was winter wilderness, capturing the raw, brutal beauty of places most people will never see. In February 2022, he ventured into a remote section of the Canadian Rockies, near the border of British Columbia and Alberta. He had rented a government-owned research cabin that was used by biologists in the summer, but sat empty and frozen for the rest of the year. To get there, Kyle had to snowmobile for 3 hours from the nearest trailhead, then trek another 2 miles on snowshoes. He was 50 miles from the nearest paved road. He was alone. He was silent. Or so he thought. Tonight, I'm bringing you Kyle's account of what happened during those 10 days in the Rockies. It's a story that reminds us that no matter how far you go into the wild to find peace, there is always someone who is already there, waiting in the shadows. If you've ever felt like someone was watching you in a place where you were supposed to be completely alone, hit that like button. It lets me know you've felt that primal chill. And if you're new to the channel, subscribe to Mr. Horror Man. We explore the darkest corners of the world so you don't have to go there yourself. Now, let's head into the peaks. The first 4 days were perfect. Kyle spent his time trekking to different ridges, capturing the diamond dust ice crystals that floated in the sub-zero air. The cabin was small but sturdy, equipped with a wood stove and a satellite phone for emergencies. On the 5th morning, Kyle stepped out onto the porch to check the weather. The world was a blank canvas of fresh, waist-deep powder. But as he looked out across the meadow that sat directly in front of the cabin, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. Right in the center of the meadow, about 50 yards from the porch, was a snow angel. It was perfectly formed. The wings were wide and smooth, and the body was indented deep into the snow. But Kyle's eyes immediately went to the area around the shape. The snow was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints leading to the angel. There were no snowshoe tracks. There were no signs of a person jumping from a tree or falling from the sky. It was as if the shape had simply been pressed into the earth by an invisible hand. He went back inside, his hands shaking as he poured a cup of coffee. He felt that visceral sensation of eyes on the back of his neck. He looked out the window at the dense tree line that bordered the meadow. The pine trees were heavy with snow, their dark branches looking like jagged fingers reaching out of the earth. "Is anyone out there?" he shouted from the porch. His voice echoed off the granite peaks and died in the thin air. No one answered. That evening, Kyle was reviewing his photos from the day. He was zooming into a high-resolution landscape of a ridge 3 miles to the north. As he scrolled through the image, he stopped. He saw a flash of color that didn't belong in the gray and white world of the Rockies. He zoomed in to 400%. Standing on a rocky outcrop nearly a mile away was a man wearing a bright red parka. He wasn't hiking. He wasn't carrying a pack. He was standing perfectly still, holding a pair of binoculars, and he was looking directly at the cabin. Kyle felt a wave of nausea. He checked the timestamp on the photo. It had been taken at 2 p.m. The man had been watching him for at least 7 hours. He grabbed his own binoculars and looked at the ridge, but it was already the blue hour. The shadows had swallowed the outcrop. He couldn't see anything but the silhouettes of the trees. He decided he was leaving. He didn't care about the photos. He didn't care about the money he'd spent on the rental. Something was deeply wrong. He began to pack his gear, his heart thumping against his ribs. He went to the shed where he had parked his snowmobile. He pulled the cover off and reached for the ignition, but his hand stopped. The fuel line had been severed. It wasn't chewed through by a marmot or a coyote. It was a clean, diagonal cut, clearly made by a sharp blade. And there, sitting on the seat of the snowmobile, was a small, frozen object. It was a pine cone, but it had been painted bright neon red. Kyle realized then that the snow angel hadn't been a fluke. It was a calling card. The man in the red parka wasn't just watching. He was already inside Kyle's perimeter. He had sabotaged the only means of escape while Kyle was busy taking pictures. Kyle retreated into the cabin and barred the door with a heavy wooden beam. He had an old bear defense shotgun that came with the cabin rental. He loaded it, his fingers flumbing with the shells. He sat on the floor, away from the windows. He didn't turn on any lights. He stayed that way for 10 hours, listening to the house groan in the wind. Around 3 a.m., the wind died down. The silence returned, that heavy, suffocating mountain silence. And then he heard it. It was a high-pitched electric sound. It sounded like a massive swarm of bees. It was hovering right outside the cabin. Kyle crawled to the window and peered over the sill. A drone, the largest one he had ever seen, was hovering 5 feet off the ground in the meadow. It was an industrial model, the kind used for surveying or high-end cinematography. And attached to the bottom of the drone, hanging by 4 steel cables, was a heavy, human-shaped metal plate. As Kyle watched, the drone lowered itself to the ground. It pressed the metal plate into the fresh snow with a powerful thud, then lifted back up. It was making another snow angel. The drone moved 6 feet to the left and repeated the process. It moved with mechanical precision, circling the entire cabin. By the time it was finished, the cabin was surrounded by a perfect ring of 50 snow angels. Kyle's phone, sitting on the table, suddenly vibrated. He had an airdrop request. The sender was simply the Watcher. With trembling fingers, Kyle accepted the file. It was a video. The video began with a shot of the cabin from above. Then the perspective changed. It showed the drone flying up to the second-story window, the window Kyle was currently looking out of. It showed Kyle's own face, terrified and pale, staring out into the darkness. But then the video cut to an earlier shot. It was a shot from inside the cabin. The drone had been flown through the chimney flue while Kyle was out hiking. The footage showed the drone hovering inches above Kyle's sleeping bag. It showed his camera gear, his food, and his satellite phone. The Watcher had been inside his home while he slept. Kyle didn't wait for the drone to return. He knew the man in the red parka was likely nearby operating the machine from a portable console. He grabbed his emergency satellite beacon, his shotgun, and his heaviest coat. He ran through the waist-deep snow, his lungs burning in the -20 air. Every time he looked up, he saw the drone. It was hovering high above the tree line, out of shotgun range, just watching him. It followed his every move like a mechanical vulture. He hiked for 6 hours. His toes were numb, his eyelashes were frozen shut. He was on the verge of collapse when he finally saw the lights of the weather station. He fired 2 shots from the shotgun into the air. The technicians at the station heard the shots and opened the heavy steel doors. Kyle collapsed into the entryway, sobbing and pointing at the sky. The drone didn't follow him to the station. As soon as the technicians stepped outside with their own high-powered spotlights, the machine turned and vanished into the peaks. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, launched a full-scale search of the area 2 days later. They found the cabin exactly as Kyle had left it, surrounded by the ring of snow angels. But when they followed the drone's likely flight path, they found something that made the lead investigator retire only 6 months later. Deep in a natural cave on the north side of the ridge, they found a high-tech surveillance hub. There were solar panels, long-range antennas, and a bank of monitors. But it wasn't just Kyle's data. The Watcher had been intercepting the satellite signals of every hiker and photographer who had used the backcountry cabins in that sector for over 3 years. He had thousands of hours of footage. He had photos of people in their most private moments. He had their names, their home addresses, and their credit card numbers. The man in the red parka was never caught. The police believe he was a former telecommunications engineer who had suffered a psychotic break and decided to turn the wilderness into his own personal Big Brother house. He didn't want to kill Kyle. He wanted to see how Kyle would react to being hunted by something he couldn't understand. Kyle moved back to the city. He sold his professional cameras. He told me that he can no longer look at a snowy field without imagining a metal plate pressing down into it. He says the most terrifying part isn't the man or the drone. It's the realization that in the 21st century, there is no such thing as a way. Even in the heart of the mountains, you are just a pixel on someone else's screen. Winter has a way of stripping us down to our most basic fears. The cold, the dark, and the isolation make us feel small. And for some people, that smallness is something to be exploited. Tonight, we've heard about the man in the crawlspace, the woman in the whiteout, and the watcher in the peaks. 3 stories that prove that the most dangerous part of the winter isn't the frostbite, it's the people who are waiting for the world to go cold so they can come out to play. Which of these stories hit you the hardest? Let me know in the comments. I'll be reading through them tonight with my doors locked and my blinds drawn. If you have a story that happened to you in the dead of winter, send it to the email in the description. I'm always looking for new accounts to share with the community. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to Mr. Horrorman. We're closing in on our next subscriber goal, and every one of you helps us shed a little light on the dark corners of this world. Stay warm, stay safe, and if you hear a humming sound over your roof tonight, don't look up. I'm Mr. Horrorman. I'll see you in the next nightmare.